Let me read to you a passage from the 10th chapter of St. John's Gospel, verses 27 to 30. It's the Gospel for the 4th Sunday of Eastertide, Year C. St. John writes, Jesus said to the Jews, "My sheep listen to my voice. I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they shall never perish. No one can snatch them out of my hand. My Father who has given them to me is greater than all. No one can snatch them out of my Father's hand. I and the Father are one." That's from John chapter 10, verses 27 to 30. What does it suggest to us? Well, one of the most notable developments of the very recent period has been the rise of a worldwide concern for the environment. The nations have realized that man has spoiled much of the world's natural habitat, and that his future resources and the beauty of his abode is under serious threat. This concern cannot but be good, and it is an excellent thing that we are now far more concerned to protect the world rather than merely to exploit it. Such a concern, though, ought to be consistent and should include a concern for deeper areas of destruction. I am referring to the deterioration of man's moral environment, which goes on from generation to generation in the life of society and in individuals. This is, strangely, of little concern for many persons. The natural world is real and concrete for them, and it is appalling to them that its beauty and its resources are being so profoundly spoiled. The moral world, though, is not very real and concrete because, well, it is not visible and tactile. What is real is what is tangible. Now, this is an assumption which has been developing the last few centuries, such that it is now a great philosophical question whether there is, for instance, a supernatural at all. The supernatural is called into question because it's not concrete, tangible. The assumption that I just mentioned also affects our perception of the moral dimension of man. Our tendency is to regard it as secondary and somewhat subjective, whereas in fact it is primary, fundamental, and absolutely objective. It is the moral life of man that affects everything for good or ill, including the way he cherishes or despoils his physical environment. I make this observation to introduce the calamity that occurred right at the first appearance in history of man. He did something which had horrific effects not on his physical environment, but on his entire moral world. He was the child of God, coming from God's hand and placed by him in what the inspired scriptures call a garden in Eden. And there he placed the man he had formed together with the woman, but they rebelled. It was an earthquake of the moral world, and it left man's moral life in ruins. His power to be good had gone. The world has had experiences of earthquakes at the base of the sea that caused tidal waves that engulfed populations. Well, the first man and woman broke off their communion with God in which they had been placed and chose a total rebellion. They wished to be gods in the sense of independent of the one and only God their Father. Well, it brought on a vast tsunami of sin that inundated the moral world of all their descendants, affecting the physical world as well. But God did not abandon man to the power of death. Rather, he foretold in a mysterious way, as we read in Genesis chapter 3 verse 15, that evil would be conquered and that man would be lifted up after his fall. There was at the beginning a first proclamation of the Messiah and the Redeemer. The future would see the salvation of God by the hand of the Messiah. And so great would this salvation be, that the original fall of man would be, well, in a sense, a happy fault, because, as the Church sings in the liturgy of the Easter Vigil, it gained for us so great a Redeemer. This is the context of our Gospel passage that I read earlier, in which Jesus Christ, the one and only Redeemer of man, speaks of saving his sheep. As we heard, Jesus said to the Jews, "My sheep listen to my voice. I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they shall never perish. No one can snatch them out of my hand. My Father who has given them to me is greater than all. No one can snatch them out of my Father's hand. I and the Father are one." He knows each one of us. You know, while Christ was preparing in the desert for his public ministry, Satan showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time. Well, if the devil could do this, how easy it would have been for Christ to have seen before him, in numerous moments of time, you and I. He knew each of us then, and he knows us now. No one can snatch us out of his hand, for he and the Father are one, the one and only God. Jesus Christ is the one who can clean up and restore the ruins of the moral world into which we are all born. The restoration begins at our baptism, when we are born again in him. It is completed with our sanctification in him. Let us often think of that from which we have been saved, while remembering that sin is still at the door, and indeed has a certain entrance. The battle is joined, but we are now with Christ, and he has delivered the victory for those who choose never to leave his side. If we depart from him, who is there to save us? No one else would even claim to, except those who deny that sin is of much importance or reality anyway, and that the visible, the tactile, the tangible, the concrete is all that really matters. But what really matters is the conquest of sin and the acquisition of goodness and holiness. Jesus Christ is the one who turns the tide. It is he, and he only, who can make us free. To him then